Okay. Where's that take us? Well, this is what it looks like. That's what the negotiations look like. You start off, you don't immediately go to Brussels with an Article 50. You do what's called scoping talks. So you work out, you go and do love-ins around the capitals of Europe, telling people how much you love them and how much you want to work with them, and flattering and schmoozing them, until such time as you've got some broad agreement as to where you're going to go. Then you clock in on your Article 50, but you've got to decide whether you can get into EFTA. If you don't, you've got a problem. And this is where my fallback came. Shadow, EEA. There's also, you can actually borrow from the Australians and the way they do things, which is quite interesting. If you get into the EEA, fine. If you can't, then you're back to bilateral or WTO, and basically you're finished. It's going to fall apart. But if you get through into the EEA, right, you repatriate law, third country agreements, all these trade agreements you've got with other countries, we're being told by the scaremongers that we lose them. No, we don't. It's a simple administrative matter, what's known as the presumption of continuity. We've just got to get their signatures to agree that the treaties continue unchanged and we're back in business. That brings us to a stage where we can conclude our Article 50 agreement. There is a thought, and it's only a thought, and I don't know necessarily it's a good one, is that we could have a referendum on the Article 50 agreement. But if the answer is no, then we are really in problems. It may be that the answer is actually a general election, but I'll leave that one hanging. Okay, now, here comes the crunch, and this is where we're getting UKIP falling apart, we're getting vote leave falling apart, is they're unable to focus on the issues of immigration, particularly asylum to a similar extent, and the idea that if you join the single market or if you stay in the single market, then you're going to have to concede freedom of movement. And they say, oh, well, freedom of movement comes first, therefore we cannot have the single market. And then we saw Dominic Cummings giving evidence a couple of days ago to the Select Committee saying, no, 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 I don't want to be in the single market. Eventually, it took about 20 minutes to get that single answer out of him. But if they do that, if they put freedom of movement first, then we don't get out. It's as simple as that. So what we've got to say is let's get out and let's then deal with immigration and asylum, and there are lots of things we can do. It doesn't mean that we're hopeless and helpless. Now, the first thing to do, and this is where at times I weep in frustration, is the inability to understand that we're dealing with a complex issue here. This is not just asylum seekers. It's not Syrians or Iranians and Afghanis coming over into Greece and what have you. There are complex issues, and there are entirely separate areas of international law and domestic law and EU law that come together for different reasons. And broadly, we break it down into two categories. This is the first layer, if you like, of distinction between regular and irregular. We hear about illegal immigration. We very often hear about asylum seekers being called illegals. They're not. And the terminology is quite important. So we've learned to call and understand what we're dealing with in these two categories: the regular migration, which is the normal legal migration that comes through our system, but then there's the irregulars, and they are a complex of refugees which have their own legal status, the economic migrants very often coming in as asylum seekers but failed, and then there's the illegals, which is not an eagle consulting the doctor. It's people actually, no, it's a very poor joke. Illegal, you know, man. Oh God, yeah, here it goes. It's people coming in by subterfuge, or most often overstayers, coming in legally and then staying illegally. So what do? First of all, we have to look at these issues separately. Regular migration is interesting, because when you look at EEA, yes, we have to adopt freedom of movement, but it ain't the same thing. There's subtle but very important differences between freedom of movement under the EEA agreement and freedom of movement within the EU treaties. And what particularly you find is that written in Article 112 of the EEA agreement are what are known as safeguard measures. This is what Mr. Cameron was talking about in terms of an emergency brake that he's managed to negotiate. But hey, he gets an emergency brake if the Commission decides and if the European Parliament approves. In other words, he has to go begging to Brussels to say, please, mister, can we actually have some sort of narrow limitations on some aspects? But written into the EEA side, if you're an EFTA state, you can impose your emergency brake unilaterally. You decide. You've got control. So EEA does give you control where you need it, if you need it, and you don't have to go begging to Brussels. So EEA is not EU. It is different, and it does give us more power. Not brilliant, but it's there. Liechtenstein has adopted it ever since they joined. But then, don't forget, third country immigration, legal immigration, actually exceeds freedom of movement. And there's an awful lot we could do there without invoking EU law. And one of the biggest problems, as we'll see also with asylum, is the ECHR, the Convention of Human Rights. And 20% of our total immigration comes in not under EU law, but comes in on right to family life, Article 8, and family reunion. And if we could address that issue, that takes out a huge tranche of people coming in. Let's look then at the irregulars. Asylum seekers are a big part of it, but not the whole part of it, because we've got the economic migrants. We've also got the irregulars. But hey, look at migrants. This is not primarily EU law. It's the UN Convention on the Treatment of Refugees that is badly in need of revision. When you actually go back through the preamble of the 51 Convention, it actually stems from agreements made in the 1920s to deal with the fallout from the Russian Revolution. So we're actually dealing with concepts that are nearly a century old. And I think it's perfectly reasonable as a nation state to say, hey, it's about time we re-looked at these in the context of the real world. But we can't do that within the EU, but we can do it without. Same goes, ECHR. We've been talking for years about getting rid of the judge-made law, just adopting the principles. We were co-signees originally. Let's look at the principles. Let's get rid of the judge-made law. Let's get rid of the court in Strasbourg and keep the principles of the convention. There we are. Charter of Fundamental Rights is the latest stupidity from Brussels of adopting and integrating not only the ECHR, but also things like the UN Convention into the treaty. So they're now locked in, where part of the treaty is now to allow asylum seekers the right of asylum now written into the EU treaties. We walk away from the treaties, we walk away from that obligation. We have bilateral treaties, and Schengen started off bilateral. We're not part of it, and we needn't stay part of it if we're out. But we've also got a lot of bilateral agreements with the French and also with the Belgians and others, particularly Sangatte. We've got the Luteque Treaty, which actually allows our officials into France so that we stop them before they can actually claim asylum. They can't claim asylum until they're on British territory, and by this bilateral agreement we keep them off British territory, which means they cannot claim asylum. And that's why in 2002 we were taking in 80,000 plus a year, and we're down to 25,000. That's because the arrangement actually works. And the reason why you see camps at Sangatte is not a failure of policy, it's a success of the policy, because they cannot get to Britain. And that's, we can develop. Okay. That's the minutiae, if you like, but the real thing about immigration is it's driven by huge global factors, mainly economic, mainly stability, war, pestilence, threats will drive it. And what we have to look at are what is known as the push-pull factors. A lot of work done on this, a lot of understanding. Very difficult to do when you've got a Brussels machine that looks at everything in isolation and cannot make up its mind what it wants to do. You get out, you can do things. And the important thing to do is integration, not with Brussels, but with our own ministries. You do not want an industrial policy which fights against your aid policy, which fights against your defence policy, which fights against all the other policies that you're dealing with. What you have to do is you have to tie them all together. And one of the really good ideas which came out of Afghanistan is get rid of DFID and get the army actually administering aid. In other words, you integrate a lot of defence policy with aid policy and you make sure it's actually delivered in a way that it actually affects the recipient country in a way that actually works. You can't do that with Brussels. So that now brings us to stage 3. And if you remember, I said we spent far too much time looking at stage 1 and not enough time and not enough focus looking at stage 3, because stage 3 is the end game when it comes to the European relationships. And what am I saying? We're looking at a genuine single market, not the thing we've got at the moment, which is a bureaucratic nightmare, but a market that is devoted to trade, not political integration. Now, immediately we say, EEA is not the answer. I concede that. People say, oh, there's all sorts of problems with the EEA. We know there are problems with the EEA. And we can list them. We can do it better than they can. Rules are made by the EU. Well, after a fashion, but we'll look at that in a minute. But that's, well, you know, Brussels are making all the rules. Yes, all right. Well, let's concede it. We don't get a seat on the top table. In the EA, all these bureaucrats and all these systems making the laws and all you do. And haven't we heard it? Don't we love it? Doesn't it show you where they're coming from? Fax law? Who's got a fax? Do they still use faxes in Brussels? I think they probably do. Although it tends to be emailed now. And I've heard this slogan used. They love it, don't they? You pay and no say. Pay, no say. All right, yeah, all right. Let's look at the reality. And that is it. Once we leave, we're looking at an entirely different relationship. And what we're starting to do is acknowledge that most of the laws are not actually made in Brussels. They're made here, global standards bodies, and they're made by this anonymous organization, strange enough also in Geneva, the ISO, International Standards Organizations. Now look at the relationship. If you're a member state, you do have input, but the decisions from EU member states go filtered via the EU. If you're in the EU, you have direct access. And you're working through directly, you have your seats on the top tables. You then decide at top level what the standards are going to be. You then pass them to Brussels. So if there's fax law, you're faxing the standards to Brussels, which then puts its brand on it, puts a number on it, and sends it back down to you. But you've been there long before they got there. So in fact, there is a very real step change once you leave. It's not ideal, but it's better. Now, where's that take us? The thing is that is your EEA acquis. Look, and you can't see it because I had to take a tiny little illustration out of an EFTA manual which showed the breakdown. And you find that when you look there, that's about 70 to 80% of your law, which is potentially made by global operations. And actually, if you stretch it, you can stretch it to about 90, 95% of that law is coming from global institutions, and a total of about, it's difficult to see, I know, but currently, as of a few days ago, the acquis, the EEA acquis, is about 5,000 laws compared with your total acquis of about 22,000. And that is going to come from organizations elsewhere. Here, I used this picture before. A fisherman, foreign fisherman, could be anywhere, filleting. He is producing a product. Who decides the law, the regulations to which he works? If he's selling into the EU, you might say it's the EU, but it isn't. It's an organization called Codex Alimentarius Commission in full. It's not based in Brussels. It's based here in Rome. And you talk about global governance, there's over 5,000 people in that office. Food and Agriculture Office, FAO, Rome, there's where your regulations are coming from. Other regulations, a huge tranche coming from here. That's not Brussels. That's absolutely the Palais des Nations. It's the old League of Nations office or building in Geneva. It's now the home office of the United Nations Economic Commission Europe, and there is the repository of the Bent Banana Directive. It's also the Bent Cucumber Directive. With great aplomb, in 2009 wasn't it, the Commission said, we have abolished the Bent Banana Directive, we have abolished the Bent Cucumber Directive and a whole load of other vegetable directives because they were so problematical, they were being mercilessly, I think that was the word, ribbed about these silly directives. But in fact, they still exist. They've been adopted, they've been set up by this body, UNIS, as marketing standards, and the EU now has a general standard for marketing vegetables and fruit, and it has exactly that, what it calls a general marketing standard. It says you must comply with the general marketing standard, but it does not define it. But it says if you want to know what's in it, look at UNIS. And if you comply with the UNIS standard, which is a direct copy out of the EU former standard with embellishments, it says if you obey UNIS, you are deemed to satisfy EU law. So what's happening is the law has moved up a stage, and it's the same goes for vehicle regulations. We talk about safety standards, emission standards, type approval standards. They've all gone to Geneva. So once again, Geneva, not Brussels, is making the law, UNIS again, and it hands down its laws to Brussels, which puts its stamp on, and then sends them to us. Now, if you want to be at the top table, that's where you're going to be. You're not going to be in Brussels, you're going to be in Geneva, you're going to be in Rome, you're going to be in Vancouver, and you're going to be in all these other countries which have international bodies where you're going to be on the top table instead of Brussels. Where's that go then? Right, now, here's where I've taken a lot of hammer. They say, oh, well, what happens if you get into the EA and we get stuck there? What guarantee can you give us that we're going to reach stage 3? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't have to give a guarantee because it's already happening. And this is where Booker sort of talked about the ignorance behind this debate. This has been going on for years and nobody is noticing, but it is what is happening and we need to be part of it. What you're getting is now technical standards increasingly are made at a global level. You're getting other instruments, you're getting conventions, and this is a very, very useful instrument. The Ramsar Convention, for instance, underwrites the whole of the Habitats Directive. It didn't start with the Habitats Directive, it started with Ramsar, and Ramsar is implemented by Habitats. Why do we need a Habitats Directive when we can go direct to the original convention together with the Berne Convention on Animal Welfare and Animal Species Protection of? We do not need the EU. We've got various inbuilt treaties at a global level, not least, God help us, the IPPC and the Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's not Brussels. That's a United Nations treaty. We could get rid of it, but only at a global level. And then, what people don't understand is there's a whole raft of non-treaty or quasi-treaty agreements. And a lot of these are happening not between member states, but they're happening between institutions. So you get the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, maybe working with the WCO, the World Customs Organization, to do a deal on expedition under the Trade Facilitation Agreement under the WTO to come to a standard procedure for handling customs documentation, which means at the bottom line, you only need to fill in one document to send any product from any country anywhere else in the world. And that does more to facilitate trade than any 100 Brussels directives. That's where we need to be.